20 years after the Buffalo Soldiers landed on New Terra, the galaxy was a different place, and the changes that began with one woman refusing to give in to bullies had rippled outward in ways that nobody could have predicted. And Margaret Hayes was 78 years old now, and her hair was completely white, and her hands shook a little when she moved, but her eyes were still bright and sharp, and she still ran her shop in the Market District, though now she had help from her daughter-in-law, Karen, and her grandchildren, who came in after school to stock shelves and talk with customers. The shop had become something of a tourist attraction, and people from across the galaxy came to New Terra just to visit it, and to meet Margaret, and to hear the story from the woman herself. And Margaret was always gracious with visitors, though. She insisted she was not a hero, and that the real heroes were the Buffalo Soldiers who risked everything to stand up for what was right. And she kept a photograph on the wall behind the counter, and it showed 200 soldiers in brown and gold armor standing in formation in the square, and beneath it was a simple caption that said, "They came when it mattered." Daniel Hayes was now Colonel Hayes, and he commanded the 47th Independent Rapid Response Battalion. And he had led the Buffalo Soldiers for 10 years, since Price retired. And under his leadership, the battalion had responded to 43 different situations where human civilians needed protection, and they had never failed, and they had never lost sight of what they were fighting for. And Daniel visited his mother as often as his duties allowed, and when he came home to New Terra, the whole colony celebrated because everyone knew he was Margaret's son, and everyone was proud of him. The Buffalo Soldiers had grown from 200 soldiers to 500, and Earth Command had created 2 additional rapid response battalions modeled on the Buffalo Soldiers, and these new units were called the Minutemen and the Guardians, and they followed the same principles in the same charter. And together these 3 battalions ensured that no human colony was ever more than a few days away from help, and their existence changed the calculus for anyone thinking about targeting human civilians, because now there would always be consequences. New Terra had become a symbol of something larger, and diplomats and military officers and students came from across human space to study what happened here, and to understand how one incident could change so much. And they walked through the Market District and visited the memorial in the square and talked with residents who remembered those days. And everyone who came away from New Terra understood that justice and courage and standing up for what was right were not just abstract concepts, but real things that real people did. The relationship between humans and Crithians had evolved in unexpected ways, and while tensions remained, there was also respect and trade, and even some cultural exchange, and young Crithians who grew up after the New Terra incident did not carry the same prejudices their parents had, and some of them even joined mixed-species military units and served alongside humans and fought together against common threats, and the old hatreds slowly began to fade, though they never disappeared completely. Victor Price died at age 72, and his funeral was attended by thousands, and soldiers came from across the galaxy to pay their respects. And Margaret Hayes spoke at the funeral, and she said that Price was the kind of leader the galaxy needed, and that he never forgot that behind every strategic decision were real people with real lives and real families, and that he taught an entire generation of soldiers what it meant to serve with honor and integrity. And when she finished speaking, there was not a dry eye in the hall. Price was buried with full military honors, and on his headstone was inscribed a quote from his testimony before the Earth Senate. And it said, "When the system breaks down, someone has to stand up," and this quote became famous, and it was repeated in speeches and taught in schools and used as a rallying cry by people fighting for justice. And it reminded everyone that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. The impact of the New Terra incident extended beyond military and political matters, and it changed how humans thought about themselves and their place in the galaxy. And before New Terra, many humans, especially those on Earth, had not thought much about the outer colonies, and they assumed everything was fine, and that the government was handling things. But after New Terra, humans everywhere became more aware and more engaged, and they demanded better protection for colonists and better representation in government, and this led to reforms that strengthened democracy and accountability. Other species noticed these changes, and they saw that humanity, despite all its internal disagreements and political divisions, would unite when its people were threatened, and this made them respect humans more and fear them a little too, because a species that would cross the galaxy to protect one shopkeeper was a species that should not be underestimated, and several conflicts that might have turned violent were resolved peacefully because potential aggressors remembered what happened. On New Terra, Margaret Hayes became a speaker and advocate for colonial rights, and she traveled across human space, giving talks about her experience and about what she learned, and she always emphasized the same themes, and she said that standing up to bullies was scary but necessary, and that ordinary people could make a difference and that the system only worked if people were willing to fight for it, and her speeches inspired thousands of people to get involved in their communities and to stand up for what was right. The annual Buffalo Soldiers Reunion was held on New Terra every year on the anniversary of the landing, and soldiers who had served in the battalion came from across the galaxy, and they gathered in the square where the memorial stood, and they told stories and remembered fallen comrades and renewed their commitment to the values they served, and Margaret always attended, and the soldiers treated her like she was one of them, and in a way she was, because her courage had inspired them and given them purpose. Daniel children grew up hearing stories about their grandmother and about the Buffalo Soldiers, and they understood from an early age that their family was part of something important, and that they had a responsibility to live up to that legacy. And Daniel's oldest son joined the Buffalo Soldiers when he turned 18, and Daniel was terrified and proud in equal measure, and he understood how his mother must have felt when he joined the military so many years ago. The story was taught in schools across human space, and children learned about Margaret Hayes and Lieutenant Colonel Price, and the 200 Buffalo Soldiers who stood up for what was right, and teachers used the story to discuss ethics and courage, and civic responsibility, and the importance of protecting the vulnerable, and generations of children grew up knowing that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they had the courage to try. As Margaret grew older, she thought more about legacy and about what she wanted to leave behind, and she realized that the most important thing was not the story itself, but the lesson it taught, and the lesson was that every person had value and every person deserved to be treated with dignity, and that standing up for these principles mattered even when it was hard, and even when it seemed like nobody was listening, because eventually people would listen, and eventually things would change. On a quiet evening in her shop, Margaret stood behind the counter where she had stood so many times before, and she looked around at the shelves and the customers and the life she had built, and she thought about that day 20 years ago, when everything changed, and she thought about the pain and the fear and the darkness, but also about the hope and the courage and the justice that followed, and she realized that she would do it all again because some things were worth fighting for. A young couple came into the shop, and they were new to the colony, and they did not know the history, and they just wanted to buy supplies, and Margaret helped them and chatted with them about their plans and their dreams, and as they left with their purchases, the woman noticed the photograph on the wall and asked about it, and Margaret smiled and said it was a long story, and that she would be happy to tell them sometime if they came back, and the couple promised they would, and they left. After they were gone, Margaret walked to the door and looked out at the market district, and she saw humans and aliens shopping together and talking and laughing and living their lives without fear, and she saw colonial security officers on patrol, keeping everyone safe, and she saw the memorial in the distance with its eternal flame, and she felt content because this was what she had fought for, and this was what the Buffalo Soldiers had fought for, and this was worth all the pain. That night Daniel called her on the video link, and he said the Buffalo Soldiers had just finished a mission on a colony world where local authorities were not protecting human workers, and the battalion had arrived and fixed the situation, and nobody had been hurt and justice had been done. And he said it reminded him of New Terra and how everything started, and Margaret told him she was proud of him and proud of all the Buffalo Soldiers, and that they were carrying on something important. The galaxy continued to change, and new challenges arose and new conflicts emerged, but humanity faced them with confidence because they knew who they were and what they stood for, and whenever someone asked, whether. The sun was setting over New Terra when everything changed for Margaret Hayes, and she stood behind the counter of her small shop in the market district, and she smiled at the customers who came in throughout the day, and she had been running this store for almost 10 years now, and everyone in the colony knew her as a kind woman who treated all species fairly, and she sold basic supplies like food, tools, and clothing, and her shop was not fancy, but it was clean and welcoming, and people from different alien races would come to buy things from her, and she never charged anyone unfairly, and she always had a kind word for everyone who walked through her door, and Margaret was 58 years old with gray hair, and warm brown eyes. And she missed her son Daniel, who was far away serving in the military, but she was proud of him and the life he had chosen. And she kept a photo of him in his uniform behind the counter where she could see it every day, and it reminded her why. She worked so hard to keep this little shop running and to be a good member of this colony community. New Terra was supposed to be a place where humans and aliens lived together in peace, and the Galactic Integration Treaty had promised that all species would be treated equally and that laws would protect everyone, and for a while it seemed to work, and humans built homes and businesses here, and aliens came to trade and live and work, and the colony grew and prospered. And Margaret had chosen to come here because she believed in that dream of different species living together and helping each other. And she thought this would be a good place to spend her later years, and maybe Daniel would come visit her when he had leave from his military duties, and they could walk through the markets together like they used to do when he was young, and she could show him how well the colony was doing and how happy she was here. But things had been changing lately, and Margaret noticed it first about 6 months ago when the Crithians started arriving in larger numbers, and the Crithians were tall aliens with thick armor-like skin, and they stood over 7 feet tall, and they were very strong. And they came from a warrior culture where strength and dominance were the most important things, and at first, they just opened a few businesses and seemed to keep to themselves. But then more came, and they started acting like they owned the place, and they would push smaller aliens out of their way in the streets, and they would demand better prices from shop owners, and if anyone complained, they would just laugh and walk away. And the colonial security forces did nothing about it. And Margaret heard rumors that the Crithians had given money to important people in the government, and that the colonial governor was afraid to stand up to them because he did not want to cause problems with the Crithian Empire. And so the Crithians just kept getting bolder and more aggressive. Margaret first had trouble with them 3 weeks ago, when a group of Crithian enforcers came into her shop and they looked around at everything she was selling, and one of them picked up a tool and asked how much it cost, and Margaret told him the price, and he laughed and said that was too much and he would pay half that amount. And Margaret politely explained that she could not sell it for that price because she would lose money, and the Crithian got angry and slammed the tool down on the counter so hard it left a dent in the wood, and he told her that she should be grateful they were even willing to buy from a human shop. And then they all left without buying anything, and Margaret's hands were shaking after they were gone, and she told her neighbor Patricia Cole about it, and Patricia was a retired nurse who had seen a lot in her life, and she told Margaret to be careful because the Crithians had been causing trouble all over the colony, and several human business owners had been hurt when they refused to do what the Crithians wanted. The Crithians came back a week later, and this time there were 5 of them, and their leader was named Cravor, and he was the biggest and meanest looking of all the Crithian enforcers, and he had scars all over his face and arms from fights he had been in, and he walked into Margaret's shop like he owned it, and he did not even look at the merchandise, and instead he just stared at Margaret and told her that things were changing in the colony, and that human businesses needed to pay security fees to the Crithian enforcers, and if they paid these fees, then the Crithians would make sure nothing bad happened to their shops. And Margaret felt her heart beating fast because she knew what this was, and it was a protection racket, and criminals back on Earth used to do the same thing, and she knew that once she started paying, she would never be able to stop, and they would just keep demanding more and more money until she had nothing left. Margaret took a deep breath and tried to keep her voice steady, and she told Cravor that she did not need their protection, and that she was running a legal business, and that she paid her taxes to the colony, and that should be enough. And she said, the colonial laws protected all businesses and all citizens regardless of their species, and Cravor just stared at her for a long moment, and then he started laughing, and the other Crithians laughed with him, and Cravor said that the laws did not matter anymore, and that the only thing that mattered was strength and power, and he said humans were weak, and that they did not deserve to have businesses in the good parts of the colony. And he told her she had 1 week to start paying the security fees or something very bad would happen, and then they left, and Margaret sat down on the stool behind her counter because her legs felt weak, and she wondered if she should just close the shop and leave New Terra. But she had put 10 years of her life into this place, and she was not going to let these bullies chase her away. A week passed, and Margaret did not pay, and she kept her shop open every day, and she served her customers, and she tried to act like everything was normal. But inside she was terrified, and she thought about sending a message to Daniel. But she did not want to worry him, and besides, what could he do? And he was 3-star systems away, and by the time he could get here it would all be over one way or another. And Patricia came by every day to check on her, and she kept telling Margaret to close the shop and get somewhere safe, but Margaret was stubborn. And she had always been stubborn, and she was not going to give in to threats and intimidation. And she believed that right had to mean something, and that standing up for what was correct mattered, even if it was hard and even if it was dangerous. On the 8th day, Cravor came back, and this time he brought 10 Crithian enforcers with him, and it was the middle of the afternoon, and the market district was crowded with people shopping and talking and going about their business. And Margaret was helping a customer when the Crithians walked in, and everyone else in the shop immediately left, and they could sense the danger, and they did not want to be there when trouble started. And the customer Margaret had been helping just put down what they were holding and hurried out the door. And Margaret stood there behind her counter, and she faced Cravor. And she knew this was going to be bad, but she was not going to beg, and she was not going to cry. Cravor asked her if she had reconsidered his offer, and Margaret said no, and she said she would not pay protection money to criminals. And Cravor's face changed, and all the fake politeness disappeared, and he told her she was a foolish old woman, and that she was going to learn what happened to humans who did not know their place. And he nodded to his enforcers, and they started destroying her shop, and they knocked over shelves and threw merchandise on the floor, and they broke her displays and tore down her signs, and Margaret tried to stop them, and she ran around the counter and grabbed one of the Crithians by the arm and told him to stop. And that was when Cravor hit her, and his fist was like a hammer, and it caught her on the side of the head, and she fell to the floor, and she could taste blood in her mouth, and everything was spinning. And she tried to get up, but another Crithian kicked her in the ribs, and she heard something crack, and the pain was so intense she could not breathe, and they kept hitting her and kicking her, and she curled up in a ball and tried to protect her head, and she thought she was going to die right there on the floor of her shop. Outside in the market, people stopped and stared, and dozens of witnesses from multiple species watched through the windows as the Crithians beat Margaret and destroyed her shop, and nobody did anything, and nobody tried to help her, and nobody called for security. And they just watched, and some of them looked away because they were ashamed, but they were also afraid. And they knew if they tried to help Margaret, then the Crithians would come for them next. And so they did nothing, and they let it happen. And this was what New Terra had become, and this was what happened when good people were too afraid to stand up for what was right. Patricia Cole was walking back from the medical center when she heard the noise, and she ran toward Margaret's shop. And she pushed through the crowd, and she saw what was happening, and she screamed at the Crithians to stop, and Cravor just looked at her and smiled. And then he kicked Margaret one more time, and Margaret stopped moving, and she just lay there on the floor in a pool of blood and broken glass. And Patricia ran inside, and she knelt beside Margaret, and she checked for a pulse, and it was there, but it was weak, and Margaret was barely breathing, and Patricia started yelling for someone to call for medical help. And finally someone did, and the Crithians just walked out of the shop. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Hayes was in the training bay of the carrier ship Valiant when his personal communication device buzzed with an urgent encrypted message, and he was overseeing combat drills with the new recruits and making sure they understood proper weapon safety protocols, and he almost ignored the message because he was busy. But something made him check it, and when he saw it was from Patricia Cole, his mother neighbor, he felt his stomach drop because Patricia would not send him an encrypted message unless something was very wrong. And he excused himself from the training bay and went to his private quarters and sealed the door, and then he opened the message, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The message started with Patricia's voice, and she sounded scared and tired, and she said she was sorry to have to tell him this, but his mother had been attacked and she was in critical condition at the medical center, and Patricia said she tried to go through official channels, but nobody was helping. And she thought Daniel needed to know the truth, and then the message showed him security footage from a shop near his mother's store, and Daniel watched in horror as Crithian enforcers destroyed his mother's shop and beat her until she stopped moving, and he watched as people stood outside and did nothing. And he watched as the Crithians walked away, laughing and bragging about what they had done, and Daniel's hand started shaking, and he had to put the device down because he felt like he was going to be sick. He forced himself to keep watching. And Patricia had included medical reports from the hospital, and Daniel read through them, and he saw the words fractured skull and broken ribs and internal bleeding and possible permanent neurological damage. And these were just words on a screen, but they were talking about his mother, and the woman who raised him and who sacrificed everything to give him a good life, and who always believed in him even when he made mistakes. And now she was lying in a hospital bed fighting for her life because some alien thugs decided to make an example of her. And Daniel felt rage building inside him. And it was a cold rage, and a focused rage. And it was the kind of rage that did not make you scream or throw things, but instead made you very calm and very dangerous. Daniel accessed the colonial news feeds from New Terra, and he searched for any mention of the attack on his mother, but there was nothing, and the colonial government had suppressed the story completely. And instead, there were stories about trade, agreements and cultural festivals and the wonderful cooperation between species on New Terra, and it was all lies. And Daniel found the colonial governor official statement about recent incidents, and it said that there had been some minor civil disputes, but that colonial security had everything under control, and that citizens should not be alarmed, and that the government was committed to maintaining peaceful relations with all species. And Daniel wanted to reach through the screen and grab the governor by the throat. He found a statement from the Crithian ambassador to New Terra, and the ambassador said that unfortunate misunderstandings sometimes happen when different species interact, and that it was important for all residents to understand proper social hierarchies and to know their place in the community. And Daniel read that line again and again, and he understood exactly what it meant. And it meant that humans were supposed to bow down and accept whatever treatment the Crithians decided to give them, and it meant his mother had been beaten nearly to death because she refused to know her place. And that made Daniel even angrier, because his mother was one of the kindest and most decent people he had ever known, and she did not deserve this, and nobody deserved this. Daniel immediately filed a request for emergency leave, and he submitted it through the proper channels, and he explained that his mother was critically injured and that he needed to go to New Terra right away, and he waited for approval, but instead, he got a message from his commanding officer, Captain Lawrence Bennett, asking him to come to the captain office, and Daniel went there hoping that Bennett was going to approve his leave, but he knew from the captain expression that the news was not good, and Bennett told him to sit down, and then he said that Daniel's emergency leave request had been denied, and Daniel asked why. And Bennett looked uncomfortable and said that the Valiant was on active deployment and they could not spare senior officers right now. Daniel argued that this was a family emergency and that regulations allowed for leave in cases like this, and Bennett agreed. But he said that orders had come from higher up and that Earth Command did not want to make a situation on New Terra worse by having military personnel show up there right now, and Daniel could not believe what he was hearing. And he asked if Earth Command knew what had happened to his mother, and Bennett said yes, they knew, and they were very sorry. But this was a political situation, and they had to think about the bigger picture and maintaining good relations with the Crithian Empire. And Daniel felt something break inside him, and he realized that his mother life meant nothing to the people in command, and that they were willing to let her suffer and maybe die just to avoid making the Crithians angry. Daniel stood up and asked if that was all, and Bennett said yes, but then he told Daniel that he understood how he felt, and that if it was his mother, he would feel the same way, but that they had to follow orders and maintain discipline, and Daniel just nodded and left the captain office, and he went back to his quarters. And for the first time in his 15-year military career, he seriously considered going absent, without leave, and just taking a shuttle and flying to New Terra and not caring what happened to him afterward. But he was a strategic thinker, and he had been trained in tactics and warfare, and he knew that going alone would accomplish nothing. And even if he made it to New Terra, what could he do? And one man could not change anything. And the Crithians would just laugh at him, and he would end up court-martialed and dishonorably discharged, and his mother would still be in the hospital. But Daniel could not just do nothing, and he could not just sit on the Valiant and pretend everything was fine while his mother fought for her life, and while the people who hurt her walked around free and unpunished. And so he started thinking about what resources he had and who he could call on for help. And he had been in the military for 15 years, and he had made a lot of friends and earned a lot of favors, and he had served with some of the best soldiers in the Earth Defense Fleet, and maybe some of them would be willing to help him, even if it meant breaking the rules, and even if it meant risking their careers. And Daniel knew this was asking a lot, but he also knew that the kind of people he had served with understood honor and loyalty and standing up for what was right even when it was hard. Daniel started sending out carefully worded messages to old friends and former unit members and people he had trained with at the academy. And he did not say exactly what he needed, but he said something had happened and that he needed help and that it was important, and the messages went out to people serving on ships across the fleet and on bases on different worlds. And Daniel did not know if anyone would respond, and he did not know if anyone would be willing to stick their neck out for him. But he had to try, and he had to believe that there were still people in the military who cared more about doing the right thing than about following orders that protected criminals. The responses started coming back within hours, and the first one was from his old squad mate, Kenny Blake, who he had served with during the Outer Colony rebellions. And Kenny's message just said he was in, and to tell him where and when. And Daniel felt relief wash over him, because if Kenny was willing to help, then maybe others would be too. And then more messages came in, and there was one from Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who had been in his class at the academy, and she said she heard about what happened and that she was ready to help however she could. And there was a message from Sergeant Frank Moore, who Daniel had trained during his first assignment as an officer, and Frank said that Daniel had always looked out for him, and now it was time to return the favor. The messages kept coming throughout the day, and by evening Daniel had responses from more than 30 people, and they were all saying the same thing, and they were all saying they would help, and they were all saying that what happened to his mother was wrong and that somebody needed to do something about it. And Daniel realized that this was bigger than just him, and bigger than just his mother. And this was about all the humans living on colony worlds who were being bullied and threatened, and hurt, and who could not count on their government to protect them. And this was about standing up and saying that human lives mattered, and that human dignity mattered, and that there were lines that should not be crossed. Daniel spent the next few hours thinking and planning, and he knew that what he was considering was dangerous, and could end his career, and could get him thrown in prison. But he also knew that he had to do it, because if he did not, then he would never be able to look at himself in the mirror again. And he thought about his mother and how she had always taught him to stand up for what was right and to protect people who could not protect themselves, and she had lived her whole life by those principles, and now she was paying the price for refusing to back down to bullies, and Daniel was not going to let that stand, and he was not going to let her suffering be for nothing. The Buffalo Soldiers had a history that went back centuries, and the name came from the old American frontier, when African-American cavalry soldiers served in the West after the Civil War, and they were called Buffalo Soldiers by the Native Americans, who fought against them and also respected them. And those soldiers faced discrimination and hatred, but they served with honor and courage, and they proved that bravery had nothing to do with skin color and everything to do with character. And in the 23rd century, when Earth needed a special military unit that would stand up for those who could not stand up for themselves, someone remembered those old cavalry soldiers and decided their name should live again. The modern Buffalo Soldiers were officially called the 47th Independent Rapid Response Battalion, and they were an elite unit within the Earth Defense Force, and unlike most military units that took whoever was assigned to them, the Buffalo Soldiers were all volunteers, and they came from backgrounds where they understood what it meant to be treated unfairly, and what it meant to fight for justice, and many of them came from colonies or from families that had been pushed around by stronger powers, and they all believed that might did not make right, and that someone needed to stand up for the weak and the vulnerable. And that was what the Buffalo Soldiers did, and that was what they had always done. Daniel Hayes had served with the Buffalo Soldiers during the Titan Moon campaign 10 years ago, and back then he was just a young officer fresh out of the academy, and he thought he knew everything about being a soldier. But the Titan Moon campaign taught him he knew nothing, and that was where he learned what real combat was like and what it meant to make life and death decisions, and what it meant to trust the soldiers beside you with your life. And Lieutenant Colonel Victor Price had been his commander during that campaign, and Price had taught him that being a good officer meant more than just knowing tactics and strategy, and it meant caring about your soldiers and protecting the people who could not protect themselves and treating everyone with dignity and respect. Price was 52 years old now, and he had been in the military for 30 years, and he had seen humanity at its best and its worst, and he had fought in more battles than most soldiers could even imagine, and he had scars on his body and in his mind from all those years of combat, but he never lost faith in what the Buffalo Soldiers stood for, and he never stopped believing that the strong had a duty to protect the weak. And when he received Daniel's message about Margaret Hayes and saw the evidence of what the Crithians had done to her, he did not hesitate, and he knew immediately what needed to be done, and he knew that Earth Command would not approve, and that there would be consequences. But he also knew that some things were more important than approval and more important than following orders. Price called an assembly of his entire battalion, and all 200 soldiers gathered in the main briefing room, and they knew something important was happening, because Price did not call full assemblies unless it was serious, and Price stood in front of them, and he did not waste time with pleasantries, and he just told them the truth, and he showed them the security footage of Margaret Hayes being beaten, and he showed them the medical reports, and he told them about how the colonial government was doing nothing, and how Earth Command had ordered military personnel to stay away, and he told them that a human woman had been nearly killed for the crime of running a shop and refusing to pay protection money to alien thugs. The soldiers watched in silence, and Price could see the anger building in their faces, and he let them feel it. And then he told them what he wanted to do, and he said this was not an officially sanctioned mission, and that if they did this, they would be putting their careers on the line, and that Earth Command would probably come down hard on all of them, and that they might face court-martials or dishonorable discharges, and he said that anyone who wanted to walk away could do so, and that he would not think less of them, and that there would be no punishment for refusing. And then he called for a vote, and he asked how many of them wanted to go to New Terra and stand up for Margaret Hayes, and for all the other humans who were being victimized. Every single hand went up, and all 200 soldiers voted to go, and Price felt pride and also fear because he knew what he was asking of them, and he knew that this could end badly, and that some of them might die and that all of them would face consequences, but he also knew that this was what the Buffalo Soldiers were for, and this was why they existed. And if they did not stand up for Margaret Hayes, then what was the point of having a unit like theirs? And what was the point of all their training and all their talk about honor and justice and protecting the innocent? The Buffalo Soldiers began immediate preparations, and they were experts at rapid deployment, because that was what they trained for, and they had 3 transport ships assigned to their battalion, and the ships were named Perseverance and Justice and Righteous, and each ship could carry about 70 soldiers plus their equipment, and the soldiers loaded their powered armor suits and their weapons and their medical supplies and everything else they would need for what might turn into a prolonged operation, and they moved with practiced efficiency, and there was no wasted motion and no unnecessary talk, and they all knew their jobs, and they all trusted each other. Daniel coordinated the logistics from the Valiant, and he used his clearances to file flight plans and movement orders, and he created a cover story that said the Buffalo Soldiers were conducting training exercises near New Terra, and this was technically allowed under their operational charter. And by the time anyone in Earth Command realized what was really happening, the Buffalo Soldiers would already be in system, and it would be too late to stop them. And Daniel felt guilty about lying, but he also felt that sometimes you had to bend the rules to do what was right, and this was definitely one of those times. Other people across the fleet started helping once they heard what was happening, and Commander Lisa Jordan ran logistics for a supply depot, and she accidentally routed extra ammunition and medical supplies to the Buffalo Soldiers, and when her superiors asked about it, she said it was a paperwork error, and she would fix it. But by then the supplies were already loaded on the transport ships, and Captain Gregory Hall commanded a destroyer in the sector, and he sent a private message to Price saying that if any naval vessels tried to intercept the Buffalo Soldiers, then his destroyer might have communication problems and might not receive those orders for several hours, and a dozen other officers quietly provided support and intelligence and resources. Word spread through the military networks about what the Buffalo Soldiers were going to do, and junior officers and enlisted personnel talked about it in mess halls and rec rooms, and the response was overwhelmingly positive, and soldiers across the fleet said it was about time someone stood up to the Crithians and about time someone showed that human lives mattered, and recruitment offices reported an increase in people wanting to join the military, and specifically wanting to join the Buffalo Soldiers. And this surprised the senior leadership, who thought the rank and file would be upset about an unauthorized mission. But they did not understand that most soldiers had family on colony worlds, and most soldiers had heard stories about humans being pushed around and discriminated against, and most soldiers believed that the military was supposed to protect people, not play political games. The Buffalo Soldiers followed a unique charter that had been written 50 years ago, when the unit was first formed, and the charter said that any Earth military officer of sufficient rank could deploy the Buffalo Soldiers if they could demonstrate that human lives or human dignity were under imminent threat, and that official channels had failed, and this charter existed because the people who created it understood that sometimes governments made bad decisions, and sometimes politics got in the way of doing what was right, and they wanted to make sure there was a military unit that could act when action was needed. And Price knew the charter backward and forward, and he knew that what he was doing was technically legal, even if Earth Command did not like it. Major Angela Scott was Price's second in command, and she had been with the Buffalo Soldiers for 8 years, and she was a brilliant tactical officer, and she started planning the operation, and she gathered intelligence about New Terra and about the Crithian compound and about colonial security forces, and she studied maps and layouts, and she identified potential problems, and she developed contingency plans for different scenarios, and she briefed the soldiers on what to expect and how to handle different situations, and she made sure everyone understood that this was not a revenge mission and that they were going to do everything by the book, and that they would only use force if the Crithians forced them to. Captain Raymond Foster was the battalion intelligence officer, and he prepared detailed briefings on Crithian culture and military capabilities, and he explained that Crithians were physically powerful, but not particularly intelligent about tactics, and that they relied on brute strength and intimidation rather than on training and coordination. And he said that Crithian society was rigidly hierarchical, and that they only respected strength, and that showing weakness would make things worse. And he said the most important thing: the 3 transport ships made the journey to New Terra at maximum burn, and they cut a 5-day trip down to 3 days by pushing the engines harder than regulations normally allowed. And aboard the Perseverance, Lieutenant Colonel Price held daily briefings with his command staff, and they went over every detail of the operation and every possible thing that could go wrong and how they would handle it. And Price wanted his soldiers to be prepared for anything, because once they landed on New Terra, there would be no backup and no support, and they would be on their own. Major Angela Scott presented intelligence that she had gathered from human sources on New Terra, and the situation was even worse than anyone had initially reported, and over the past 6 months, 17 humans had been hospitalized following attacks by Crithian enforcers, and 5 human businesses had been burned down, and the colonial government under Crithian influence had ruled in favor of the aliens in every single dispute, and it was clear that humans had become second-class citizens in their own colony and that the system was completely broken. The Crithians had set up what was basically a protection racket, and they forced human business owners to pay security fees, and if the humans refused, then bad things happened, and their shops got vandalized or burned down, and they got beaten up. And the colonial security forces did nothing because the security chief had been bribed, and the colonial governor was afraid of causing an interspecies incident, and so the Crithians just kept getting bolder and more aggressive, and they started treating humans like they were animals or slaves and not like fellow citizens with rights and dignity. Captain Raymond Foster briefed the soldiers on Crithian culture and military capabilities, and he explained that Crithians were physically imposing, and they averaged 7 feet tall with natural armor plating on their bodies that made them hard to hurt with normal weapons, and they were very strong and could lift several times what a human could lift, and their society was organized like a military hierarchy, where the strongest were in charge, and everyone else followed orders without question, and they believed that strength was the only thing that mattered, and that weak species did not deserve respect or fair treatment. Foster explained that the Crithians had never faced human military forces in direct combat, and their only experience with humans had been with civilians and lightly armed security forces, and because of this, they had developed a profound contempt for humanity, and they viewed humans as a species of merchants and bureaucrats who were good at making money and writing laws, but who were not warriors and who would run away at the first sign of real danger. And this contempt had made them careless and overconfident, and that was going to be their downfall. Price told his soldiers that their advantage was training and technology and discipline, and the Crithians might be strong, but they had no idea how to fight as a coordinated unit, and they had no experience with modern military tactics, and they had certainly never faced soldiers in powered armor, And Price said the key was to hit them hard and fast and show them immediately that this was not going to be like bullying unarmed civilians, and that if they wanted a fight, then the Buffalo Soldiers would give them one they would never forget. Daniel Hayes addressed the Buffalo Soldiers via video link from the Valiant, where he was still technically on duty. And he thanked them for answering his call, and he told them that his mother was still unconscious but stable, and that the doctors thought she would survive, but they did not know yet if there would be permanent damage. And Daniel's voice cracked a little when he talked about her, and he said this mission was not about revenge, but about sending a message. And the message was that humans would not be victimized without consequence, and that human dignity mattered, and that human lives mattered. Someone aboard the Perseverance recorded Daniel's speech and leaked it to the military networks, and within 24 hours it was spreading through the entire Earth Defense Fleet, and junior officers and enlisted personnel watched it in mess halls, in rec rooms, and on personal devices, and the response was overwhelming. And soldiers across the fleet started talking about the Buffalo Soldiers mission, and about whether they would have the courage to do what Price and his battalion were doing. And support for the mission became so strong that senior leadership realized they could not publicly condemn it without causing a revolt among the rank and file. Back on New Terra, word began to spread through the human community that help was coming, and Patricia Cole quietly passed the information to trusted neighbors, and she told them that soldiers were on their way, and that someone was finally going to stand up to the Crithians. And at first people did not believe her because they had given up hope, and they thought nobody cared about what happened to them. But Patricia showed them messages she had received from people who knew people in the military, and slowly the humans on New Terra started to believe that maybe things were going to change. The Crithian enforcers heard rumors too, but they dismissed them as human desperation and wishful thinking. And one of their leaders, named Cravor, who had personally beaten Margaret Hayes, publicly mocked the idea of human soldiers coming to New Terra, and he stood in the market district where everyone could hear him, and he announced that if the humans wanted to send their soldiers, then the Crithians would break them just as easily as they had broken the old woman. And his followers laughed, and they all agreed that humans were weak and cowardly, and that no human soldier would dare to stand against them. Someone recorded Cravor's speech and transmitted it to the Buffalo Soldiers, and Price played it for the entire battalion. And nobody said anything, but Price could see the change in his soldiers' faces, and he could see the cold determination and the quiet anger, and he watched as they checked and rechecked their equipment with renewed focus. And he knew that Cravor had just made a fatal mistake, because he had given the Buffalo Soldiers even more motivation, and he had made it personal. And that was something you never wanted to do with soldiers who were already angry, and who already had justice on their side. On the third day, the three ships arrived at New Terra, and they dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, and immediately broadcast their military identification on all channels, and Price sent a formal notification to the colonial government and to the Crithian compound. And the message said that the 47th Independent Rapid Response Battalion had arrived to investigate attacks on human citizens and to ensure their safety, and that all parties involved in the assault on Margaret Hayes were ordered to surrender themselves for military tribunal within 24 hours. Colonial Governor Adrian Cross received the message and immediately panicked, and he sent frantic messages to Earth Command, asking what he should do and saying that this was going to cause a major diplomatic incident and that the Crithians were going to be furious, and Earth Command sent back messages telling him to stall and to try to convince the Buffalo Soldiers to leave and to not do anything that would escalate the situation. But Cross knew it was already too late, and that there was no way to stop what was about to happen. The Crithian leadership received Price's message and they laughed, and they sent back a reply that said they did not recognize human military authority on New Terra, and that the Buffalo Soldiers should leave within 1 hour or face consequences. And the message was arrogant and dismissive, and it showed that the Crithians still did not understand what they were dealing with, and they still thought they could intimidate the humans like they had been doing for months. Price read the Crithian response aloud to his command staff, and Major Scott asked what their orders were, and Price looked at her and at Captain Foster and at all the other officers who had trusted him and followed him, and he thought about Margaret Hayes lying in a hospital bed and about all the other humans who had been hurt, and he thought about his duty as a soldier and as a human being, and he gave the only order that made sense, and he said they were going to land the troops. The 3 transport ships entered New Terra atmosphere in tight formation, and they broadcast their military transponder codes on all frequencies and the Colonial Defense Grid tracked them, but did nothing because Governor Cross had frozen in fear and could not decide whether to order them to leave or to let them land. And by the time he finally made a decision, the ships were already through the upper atmosphere and heading for the surface, and it was too late to stop them. The ships descended over the colony capital, and people on the ground stopped what they were doing and looked up at the sky, and they saw 3 large military transport ships coming down, and the humans who had heard the rumors knew immediately what was happening, and they started crying with relief, and they called their friends and neighbors and told them that the soldiers had arrived and that help was finally here. And the aliens watched nervously because they could sense that something big was about to happen, and even the Krithians stopped their usual bullying and strutting and watched the ships with concern. The 3 ships landed in a large public square 3 blocks from the Krithian compound, and the landing was deliberate and theatrical, and it was designed to send a message, and the message was that the Buffalo Soldiers were not hiding, and they were not sneaking around, and they were here in full force and in broad daylight. The Krithian compound sat in the center of the colony like a fortress, and it was a large building made of reinforced concrete and metal, and it served as both barracks and headquarters for the 300 Krithian enforcers who had taken control of large parts of New Terra, and the compound had high walls and guard towers, and the Krithians thought they were untouchable there, but they had never faced a real military force, and they were about to learn what a mistake that was. Cravor stood on the wall of the compound and watched the Buffalo Soldiers marching toward him, and he had 50 of his best warriors with him, and they were all armed with pulse rifles and melee weapons, and they were confident because they outnumbered the humans, and they were bigger and stronger, and they had natural armor that protected them, and Cravor had beaten hundreds of humans in his time, and he did not think these soldiers would be any different. And he told his warriors to prepare for battle and to show these humans what happened when they dared to challenge Krithian authority. Lieutenant Colonel Price stopped 10 meters from the compound entrance, and his soldiers formed up behind him in perfect ranks, and Major Scott stood at his right side, and Captain Foster stood at his left, and all 3 of them wore powered armor, but their helmets were off so the Krithians could see their faces. And Price looked up at Cravor, and he spoke in a loud, clear voice that carried across the square. And he said he was Lieutenant Colonel Victor Price of the Earth Defense Force, and that Cravor was accused of assault with intent to kill against a human civilian, and that he had one opportunity to surrender peacefully and face justice in a military tribunal. Cravor laughed, and it was a deep guttural sound that echoed off the buildings, and he said that humans did not give orders to Krithians, and that the Buffalo Soldiers should leave now while they still could. And he said that Krithians were warriors, and humans were merchants, and that this would not end well for Price and his soldiers. And he said they would break these humans just like they had broken all the others. And Cravor pulled out his weapon and pointed it at Price and told him this was his last chance to walk away. Price nodded slowly like he had expected this response, and he had given Cravor the chance to do the right thing. And Cravor had refused, and now there was only one option left. And Price turned to Major Scott and said 2 words that would become famous across the galaxy, and he said, "Light them up." And Scott smiled and gave the order. And what happened next was something the Krithians would never forget. The Buffalo Soldiers engaged with devastating precision, and this was not a brawl or a riot, and it was a surgical military operation executed by trained professionals who knew exactly what they were doing, and squads moved in coordinated patterns that had been practiced thousands of times, and they used overlapping fields of fire and covered each other advances, and they moved like they were one organism instead of 200 individuals, and the Krithians had never seen anything like it. Stun rounds dropped Krithians in waves, and the powered armor made the Buffalo Soldiers fast and strong and nearly impossible to hurt. And when a Krithian fired a pulse rifle at a soldier, the blast just bounced off the armor plating and did no damage. And the soldiers advanced steadily and methodically, and they used minimum force where possible. But when Krithians tried to fight with lethal weapons, the soldiers responded with lethal force, and the Krithians started falling, and they realized, too late, that they were not fighting civilians anymore. Cravor fired his pulse rifle at Price, and the blast hit Price's chest armor and did nothing, and Price just kept walking forward. And Cravor fired again and again, and nothing happened, and then Price was right in front of him, and Cravor tried to punch but Price caught his fist, and the powered armor gave Price 10 times normal strength, and he squeezed, and Cravor felt his bones breaking, and he screamed and dropped his weapon and tried to pull away, but Price held him and looked him in the eyes and said, This is for Margaret Hayes, and then Price threw Cravor 20 feet through the air, and Cravor hit the ground hard and did not get up. Within 15 minutes, all 50 Crithian warriors were either unconscious or restrained, and not a single Buffalo soldier had been seriously injured. And the other Crithians in the compound saw what happened, and some of them tried to mobilize a defense, but most of them just tried to run. And the Buffalo soldiers had anticipated this, and they had teams positioned at all the exits, and they caught the Crithians as they tried to escape, and they processed them efficiently and professionally. The compound itself fell within an hour, and the Buffalo soldiers went through it room by room, and they cleared each level and secured all weapons and arrested everyone they found, and they did it all by the book, and they followed proper military procedure, and they documented everything with cameras and recorded statements, and they made sure that no one could say later that the Buffalo soldiers had acted improperly or used excessive force. Captain Foster had been right about the Crithians, and their contempt for humans had made them careless, and they never bothered to properly fortify their compound because they never thought they would face a real military assault, and their weapons were outdated by human standards, and their tactics were non-existent, and they fought as individuals instead of as units, and against trained soldiers with superior technology and tactics they never had a chance. By the end of the first hour, the entire Crithian enforcement presence on New Terra had been neutralized, and 17 Crithians were dead because they chose to fight to the end and would not surrender, but most of them were captured alive and held in a secure perimeter that the Buffalo soldiers set up around the compound, and the soldiers treated the prisoners correctly and gave them medical attention and food and water, and they followed the rules of war, even though the Crithians had not followed any rules when they were attacking civilians. Price established a command post in the square where they had landed, and he ordered his soldiers to begin security patrols throughout the colony. And the message was clear and simple, and it was that humans were under military protection now, and that any further attacks would be met with immediate and overwhelming force. And the soldiers fanned out in teams, and they walked through the human quarter, and they made sure everyone could see them, and everyone would know that things had changed. The local humans came out of their homes and shops, and they surrounded the Buffalo soldiers, and they wanted to shake their hands and thank them, and some of them were crying. And Patricia Cole found Price, and she grabbed his armored hand, and she told him about Margaret and about how she was still in the hospital, and Price told Patricia that they had guards posted at the hospital, and that Margaret was safe now, and that no one would hurt her again. And Patricia just nodded, because she could not speak, and tears were running down her face. Daniel Hayes was monitoring everything from the Valiant, and he had access to the tactical feeds from the Buffalo soldiers' helmet cameras, and he watched as his friends and former comrades took down the Crithians and secured the compound and protected the human civilians. And when it was over, and Price sent the message that said package secured and no friendly casualties, and your mother is under guard, Daniel put his head down on his desk and cried, and they were tears of relief and gratitude and pride. Governor Cross tried to assert his authority, and he sent a message demanding that Price report to the Colonial Administration building immediately. But Price sent back a message saying he was busy ensuring the safety of human citizens, and that he would meet with the governor when it was convenient. And Cross realized that he had no power anymore, and that the Buffalo soldiers were in control now, and there was nothing he could do about it. The other alien species on New Terra watched everything that happened, and they were shocked and amazed, and some of them were frightened because they had thought humans were weak, and now they realized that humans had been choosing not to use their full strength, and that when humans decided to fight, they were terrifying and efficient and deadly. And the aliens started treating the remaining humans with more respect because they understood now that humanity had not forgotten its colonists, and that attacking humans would bring consequences. Price gave a speech in the main square, and hundreds of humans gathered to listen, and he told them that the Buffalo soldiers would remain on New Terra until he was confident that the colonial government could protect human citizens and that justice would be served. And he said that what happened to Margaret Hayes was unacceptable and would never happen again. And he said that human dignity mattered, and human lives mattered, and that Earth had not forgotten them and would never abandon them. The humans cheered, and some of them started chanting Buffalo soldiers, and the chant spread through the crowd, and Price stood there in his armor and listened, and he felt the weight of responsibility because he knew this was not over, and that there would be political consequences, and that Earth Command was probably furious, but he also knew that he had done the right thing, and that his soldiers had done the right thing, and that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. News of what happened spread across the galaxy within hours, and human colonies everywhere heard about how the Buffalo Soldiers had stood up to the Crithians and protected Margaret Hayes and defended human dignity. The news reached Earth Command within hours of the Buffalo Soldiers landing on New Terra, and Admiral Charles Morrison, who was head of the Defense Council, was in a meeting when his aide rushed in and told him what had happened, and Morrison's face went red and he dismissed everyone from the room, and then he sat alone at his desk trying to decide what to do. And on one hand, Price and the Buffalo Soldiers had acted without authorization and had potentially started a diplomatic crisis with the Crithian Empire, but on the other hand, they had done what Earth Command should have done months ago, and Morrison knew that the public and the military would support Price even if the politicians did not. Morrison issued a public statement condemning Price for exceeding his authority and demanding a full investigation, and the statement was harsh and formal, and it said that unauthorized military operations would not be tolerated, and that the chain of command must be respected. But then Morrison sent a private encrypted message to Price, and in that message he wrote something very different, and he said that officially Price was facing a court-martial, but unofficially it was about time someone stood up to these aliens and that Price should hold his position, and that Earth Command would sort out the politics. Among human colonies, especially those in the outer sectors, the reaction was pure jubilation, and celebrations broke out spontaneously, and people who had never met Margaret Hayes felt connected to her story because it could have been any of them. And they had all felt abandoned by Earth, and now they knew that someone was watching out for them. And in bars and meeting halls across dozens of worlds, humans toasted the Buffalo Soldiers and told stories about what they had done. And with each, telling the story got bigger and more dramatic, but the core truth remained the same. The Crithian Empire lodged a formal protest with the Galactic Council, and they demanded that Price and all his soldiers be turned over for trial in Crithian courts, and they claimed it was an act of unprovoked aggression against their citizens, and they said that humans had violated the Galactic Integration Treaty and should face severe sanctions, and the Crithian ambassador was loud and angry, and he pounded his fist on the table and demanded justice. Ambassador Helen Wright represented Earth at the Galactic Council, and she was a skilled diplomat who had been doing this job for 20 years, and she listened calmly to the Crithian ambassador rant, and when he was finished, she stood up and began presenting evidence, and she had security footage from multiple angles, showing Crithian enforcers beating Margaret Hayes, and she had medical reports showing the extent of her injuries, and she had financial records showing the protection racket, and she had recorded statements from dozens of human victims, and the evidence was overwhelming and ironclad. Wright argued that the Buffalo Soldiers had acted within the bounds of military law to protect human citizens when local authorities had failed to do so. And she pointed out that Earth had tried to work through official channels, but that the colonial government was either unwilling or unable to protect its human residents, and she said that the Galactic Integration Treaty guaranteed equal protection under the law for all species, and that the Crithians had violated that treaty repeatedly, and that Earth had every right to protect its citizens. The Galactic Council was divided, and several species, particularly those who had been victimized by Crithian aggression, themselves supported Earth's position, and they said that the Crithians had been getting away with bullying smaller species for too long, and that it was good someone finally stood up to them, but other species worried about the precedent, and they said that if every species could deploy military forces whenever they felt their citizens were threatened, then there would be chaos, and the council debated for days. On New Terra, Governor Cross tried to reassert his authority, and he demanded that Price withdraw his forces, and he threatened to have Price arrested for interfering with colonial government. But when Cross made this threat, Major Scott, who was standing beside Price, just looked at him and quietly pointed out that Cross had no forces capable of arresting anyone anymore, and that attempting to do so would be extremely unwise, and Cross realized she was right, and he backed down. Daniel Hayes finally received permission to take emergency leave, and he arrived on New Terra aboard a fast courier ship that made the trip in record time, and he went directly to the medical center where his mother was being treated, and Buffalo soldiers were posted outside her room, and when Daniel arrived they saluted him and stepped aside, and Daniel went in and saw his mother lying in the bed with tubes and monitors attached to her, and she looked small and fragile, and he sat down beside her and took her hand and cried. Margaret Hayes regained consciousness 2 days after the Buffalo Soldiers arrived, and her eyes opened slowly, and she looked around confused, and the first thing she saw was Daniel sitting beside her bed, and she tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and Daniel gave her water and she drank, and then she asked in a weak voice if she had missed something, and Daniel laughed and cried at the same time, and he told her everything. Margaret listened quietly as Daniel explained about the Buffalo Soldiers, and about how 200 soldiers had come to New Terra because of what happened to her, and about how they had taken down the Crithian enforcers and protected the human colonists, and tears streamed down her face as she listened, and when Daniel finished, she said that those soldiers did not have to do that for her. And Daniel held her hand and said they did it because it was right, and because someone had to stand up. Price visited Margaret personally, and he brought flowers that his soldiers had collected. And when he walked into her hospital room, Margaret tried to sit up, but Price told her to rest, and he sat down beside her bed, and he told her that she was braver than most soldiers he had known, and that she had refused to give in to bullies even when it cost her everything. And he said she had given the Buffalo Soldiers a reason to remember who they were and what they stood for, and that if anyone deserved thanks, it was her. The imprisoned Crithians were processed according to military law, and each one was interviewed and charged and given access to legal representation, and the trials were conducted with full military formality, and every defendant had a chance to present their case and to call witnesses, and the proceedings were broadcast across the galaxy, so everyone could see that this was not revenge, but justice. Cravor was tried first, and the evidence against him was overwhelming, and there were dozens of witnesses who testified about what he had done to Margaret and to other humans, and there was security footage and medical records, and even some of his own warriors testified against him, hoping for reduced sentences, and Cravor tried to claim he was just following Crithian cultural practices, but the judges pointed out that Crithian culture did not override the laws that govern New Terra, and that everyone who lived in the colony had to follow those laws. Cravor was found guilty of assault with intent to kill and destruction of property, and violations of the Galactic Treaty provisions on civilian protection, and he was sentenced to 20 years in a human military prison. And when the sentence was read, Cravor showed no emotion. But everyone watching knew that this was a message. And the message was that attacking humans would have consequences, and that justice would be done fairly but firmly. The other Crithians received varying sentences based on their level of involvement, and some got long prison terms, and some got shorter sentences, and some who had only been following orders and had not personally hurt anyone were released with warnings, and the trials took weeks, but they were thorough and fair, and even the Crithian Empire eventually admitted that the process had been conducted properly, even though they did not like the results. Back on Earth, the political firestorm continued, and the Secretary of Defense Patricia Morgan faced intense pressure from multiple sides, and peace advocates demanded that Price be prosecuted for unauthorized military action, and they said he had acted like a warlord, and that this could not be tolerated, but colonial representatives demanded that Price be promoted, and his actions endorsed, and they said he had done what the government should have done, and that he was a hero. The Earth Senate convened hearings, and Price was ordered to testify via subspace link, though he refused to leave New Terra until a permanent security solution was in place, and his testimony was broadcast live across human space, and billions of people watched, and Senator Gregory Nash led the prosecution, and he argued that Price actions set a dangerous precedent, and that if every military officer could deploy forces based on their personal judgment, there would be chaos. Price's response was calm but firm, and he said that the chain of command had failed Margaret Hayes and every other human on New Terra, and that when the system breaks down, someone has to stand up, and that was what the Buffalo Soldiers did. And Senator Linda Cooper, who represented an outer colony district, led Price's defense, and she presented testimony from dozens of colonists who described years of abuse and official indifference, and she read Margaret medical reports into the record, and she played the recording of Cravor, mocking the idea of human military intervention. Cooper argued that the question was not whether Price followed proper procedure, but whether humanity as a civilization would tolerate its citizens being brutalized while hiding behind bureaucratic. The months following the Buffalo Soldiers' intervention on New Terra brought changes that nobody had anticipated, and the changes spread far beyond one colony world and touched every corner of human space and affected how humans saw themselves and how other species saw humanity. And it started conversations about justice and protection and duty that would continue for years, and the name Buffalo Soldiers became synonymous with standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult, and even when powerful people said you should not. On New Terra itself, the transformation was remarkable, and within 6 months the colony was barely recognizable, and human businesses that had been struggling or closed reopened and thrived, and new businesses started because people felt safe again, and they believed that the law would protect them, and that bullies would face consequences. And the streets that had been dangerous for humans were now patrolled by both colonial security forces, who had been reformed, and by a permanent detachment of Earth military personnel who made sure everyone remembered what happened when humans were mistreated. Governor Cross was removed from office and replaced by Richard Lane, who was a former military officer and a colonial representative who actually cared about protecting all citizens, regardless of species, and Lane worked with both human and alien residents to rebuild trust and create a system where everyone was treated fairly. And he met with community leaders from every species and listened to their concerns, and he made it clear that the law applied equally to everyone, and that violence and intimidation would not be tolerated from anyone. The Krithians, who remained on New Terra after their enforcers were expelled, had to adjust to the new reality. And at first many of them were angry and resentful, but gradually they realized that the changes benefited them too, because now they could do business without worrying about their own enforcers extorting them, and without having to participate in protection rackets. And the honest Krithians who just wanted to live and work in peace found that humans were willing to trade with them fairly, and some unlikely friendships developed between humans and Krithians, who realized they had more in common than they thought. Margaret Hayes' shop reopened on the 1-year anniversary of the attack, and the grand reopening was attended by Lieutenant Colonel Price and Major Scott and 24 Buffalo Soldiers who happened to be in system for training exercises, and the message was subtle, but everyone understood it, and it meant that the Buffalo Soldiers were still watching, and that New Terra had not been forgotten. And Margaret gave a brief speech, and she said she was just one woman who ran a shop, but that what happened here was about something bigger. Margaret said it was about whether humans would stand up for each other, and whether they would protect the vulnerable, and whether they believed that every human life had dignity and value. And she said the Buffalo Soldiers answered those questions. And the crowd cheered, and many people were crying, and Margaret looked out at all the faces, and she saw humans and aliens standing together, and she felt hopeful about the future in a way she had not felt for a long time. The Buffalo Soldiers received official recognition from Earth Command, and their actions were retroactively approved, and Price was promoted to full colonel, though he chose to maintain command of the 47th Battalion because he loved his soldiers and could not imagine leaving them. And the unit received increased funding, and better equipment, and recruitment surged with thousands of young officers specifically requesting assignment to the Buffalo Soldiers, and Price had to be very selective about who he accepted because he wanted people who understood what the unit stood for. Daniel Hayes thrived in his new role with the Buffalo Soldiers, and he became the battalion primary naval liaison, and he used his expertise to improve their rapid deployment capabilities and to develop better coordination between the Buffalo Soldiers and the rest of the fleet. And he visited his mother regularly on New Terra, and she always had the same question, which was, when was he going to settle down? And his answer never changed, and he said when there was nothing left worth fighting for. The impact on other colonies was profound, and humans living on outer worlds who had felt abandoned and vulnerable suddenly felt connected to Earth again, and they knew that if something happened to them, there would be consequences, and that someone would come to help. And this changed the dynamic between humans and other species on those worlds, and aliens who had been pushing humans around started treating them with more respect because they understood that humanity was watching and would act. The new policy of assigning military security detachments to colonies with large human populations was implemented across dozens of worlds, and the soldiers were trained not just in combat, but in diplomacy and community relations, and their job was not to dominate or intimidate, but to protect and to make sure that local authorities did their jobs, and to serve as a reminder that human citizens had rights and that those rights would be defended, and most of the detachments never had to fire a shot because their presence alone was enough to deter trouble. The Krithian Empire struggled to adapt to the new situation, and some in their leadership wanted to retaliate, but others recognized that times had changed and that humanity was not going to be pushed around anymore. And slowly the Krithians began to adjust their behavior, and their aggression toward human colonies stopped. And some Crithian military officers began studying human military tactics, and they were impressed by what they learned, and a grudging respect developed between the two species even though tensions remained. The story of the Buffalo Soldiers spread beyond military circles and into popular culture, and books were written about the New Terra incident, and documentaries were produced, and songs were composed, and children played games where they pretended to be Buffalo Soldiers rescuing civilians from aliens. And in the oral tradition of soldiers everywhere, the tale was told and retold, and with each telling it got more dramatic. But the core message remained the same, and it was that when pushed far enough, humans would fight for their own. A memorial was erected in New Terra Central Square near where the Buffalo Soldiers had landed, and it was not a celebration of violence but a commemoration of the moment when a community stood together, and the inscription read in honor of those who defended the defenseless and reminded us all that justice delayed is not justice denied. And people came from across the colony to visit the memorial and to remember what happened and why it mattered. Other alien species took note of what happened, and the incident became a case study in galactic politics, and ambassadors and military strategists analyzed the New Terra situation and discussed what it meant for interspecies relations and humanity, which had been seen primarily as the galaxy merchants and diplomats had demonstrated that it possessed both the capability and the will to defend its interests by force if necessary, and this changed how other species approached negotiations with Earth. The Galactic Council passed new resolutions about colonial protection and civilian rights, and these resolutions were largely symbolic, but they showed that the Council recognized that something had changed, and that the old way of doing things, where powerful species could bully weaker ones without consequence, was no longer acceptable. And several smaller species who had been victimized by larger powers thanked Earth for standing up, because it gave them hope that maybe they could stand up too. Margaret Hayes lived to see her grandchildren, and Daniel eventually did settle down with a nurse from the colony named Karen Mills, whom he met during his mother recovery, and they had 3 children, and Margaret loved spending time with them and telling them stories, and she always emphasized the same point, and she said the real heroes are not the ones who fight, but the ones who choose to make the fight about something bigger than themselves. And her grandchildren listened, and they understood that their grandmother was not just a shopkeeper, but someone who had stood up for what was right even when it cost her everything. On the anniversary of the New Terra incident, the Buffalo Soldiers observed a tradition, and wherever they were deployed, whether on Earth or on distant colony worlds or aboard ships in space, they gathered and raised a toast, and the toast was always the same, and it was to the dignity of every human life, and to the promise that no one fights alone. And this tradition spread to other military units, and eventually to civilians, and it became a way for humans across the galaxy to remember what happened and why it mattered. Colonel Price continued to lead the Buffalo Soldiers for another 15 years before he finally retired, and during those years the battalion responded to dozens of situations where human civilians needed protection, and they became legendary for their effectiveness and their commitment to justice. And when Price finally stepped down, he gave a speech to his soldiers, and he told them that what they did mattered, and that every person they protected and every bully they stood up to made the galaxy a better place, and he said he was proud to have served with them. Price's successor was Daniel Hayes, who had learned everything Price could teach him, and who understood what the Buffalo Soldiers stood for. And under Daniel's leadership, the battalion continued to grow and to adapt and to serve, and Daniel often thought about his mother, and about how her refusal to back down to bullies had started everything.